Since the introduction of the historical lectures for AAS around 2007, there is slight debate. This feature of the program has been greatly appreciated. Philosophers tell us that it's critical in order to plan our future that we have a solid understanding of our past. This is especially important for our younger members. I'm honored to introduce a longtime friend and accomplished colleague, Dr. Patricia Newman. Dr. Newman is the SUNY Lloyd S. Rogers Emeritus Professor of Surgery and has held many leadership positions both inside and outside of SUNY. It's appropriate that she's giving the historical lecture. She's made history herself, having been the first woman to serve as president of the American College of Surgeons, as chair of the American Board of Surgery, and as the first woman elected to the AMA Council on Scientific Affairs. She's held leadership roles within AAES, and she was a founding member of the AWS, American Women's Surgeons. She's published numerous articles, abstracts, and book chapters. Her contributions both to equity for women and in treating thyroid and parathyroid disease are truly significant. Today she will delight us with her talk entitled An Ode to the Indian Rhinoceros. Dr. Newman.
Thank you, Sally. Sally, members and guests, it's really an honor and a privilege to be able to give this presentation. I've always had a tremendous interest in the history of surgery and the history of medicine since I was a medical school student, and we actually had a class, and it was the only class in those days that was at 7 a.m., and for anybody who knows me, for me to get up and go to a meeting at 7 a.m., I had to really love it. So that was important. And when I was asked to do this, I thought, what can I speak about? I've learned that it's always easier to speak about something that you know about, and so I decided to speak about parathyroid disease. I really have nothing to disclose other than I've had a 50-year fascination with parathyroid disease and parathyroid surgery, and it's also caused me to collect rhinos, as certainly that is the origin of our specialty. The Ode to the Indian Rhinoceros is actually a title of an article that was published in 1970 in Surgical Clinics of North America. Its subtitle was, Or the Evaluation and Preparation for Parathyroid Surgery, and it really gives you a lot of information about the origin of parathyroid surgery and the difficulties that we had in those days. It was written by Michael Schaefer and Steve Economou, and it was published the year I finished my surgical residency. In those days, you really didn't see very much parathyroid disease. My surgical textbook of 1964 was, really had a very small section, only a few pages on parathyroid disease. The chapter, though, fortunately was written by Oliver Cope, and it was entitled Thyroid, Thymus, and Parathyroid. Interesting that they put thymus in there. And it described the first two cases of parathyroid disease, 1925 in Europe and 1926 in America. And they both had significant bone disease. And bone disease was really the part of parathyroid disease that was discovered first. And it wasn't until 1932 that there was the description of parathyroid disease with renal stone disease, not with bone disease. And this really created a new era because people did have kidney stones. You could then measure their calcium levels. And parathyroid disease went from rare to what they considered common. What they considered common really meant that you would see it, not that it would happen every day, many, many times everywhere in America. And in Cope's chapter, he had some interesting observations that tell you a little bit about the history. One was that the diagnosis was only made by keeping hyperparathyroidism in mind. When you saw people with renal disease and with bone disease or peptic ulceration or pancreatitis, it wasn't a disease that was found in a milder state. He reported in 1964 the first 300 cases at the Massachusetts General Hospital. That would have been 300 cases between 1926 and 1964, less than 10 a year. And if we only saw 10 a year, none of us would be sitting here. In that, he also presented 11 cases of cancer, again, about the same ratio that we have today. And he said that this should be expected when the gland was stuck. Not that it should be suspected from the pathology and the cellular pathology. Again, a wonderful observation. And he said it was rarely possible to make the diagnosis of hyperparathyroidism before one of its complications. And medical and irradiation therapy have not proven to be successful. Amazing observations early in the course of a disease. And he said it is obvious that the surgeon must be tutored in what parathyroids look like before embarking on a parathyroid operation. We certainly embrace that concept totally. And he had in that chapter an amazing description of the location of parathyroid glands. And if you look at his history, you can certainly understand why. Dr. Cope was born in 1902, and he did his training at Massachusetts General Hospital, and he laid the foundation for parathyroid surgery. He was recruited there by Edward Churchill, the new chair of surgery at Mass General, and he was recruited to perform anatomic dissections of the parathyroids with Benjamin Castleman, who was also a relatively new pathologist at MGH. And with Churchill, he performed the 7th parathyroidectomy and the first medial parathyroid exploration on Captain Charles Martel, the famous index case of hyperparathyroidism that also is probably responsible for us having our specialty fairly well to ourselves. Because, as you know from Captain Martel, they didn't find his disease in the neck. Over and over again, they didn't find his disease in the neck. And because of Cope's dissections and his understanding of parathyroid disease, and again, with the support of Captain Martel, he had this 7th operation, which did find his disease in the mediastinum. He was cured of his hyperparathyroidism, but died of the complications of his parathyroid disease. Cope published successively larger and larger series of parathyroidectomies, the initial one being 11 cases up to about 600. And he made many very important observations, such as if the gland is stuck, it's probably carcinoma. His daughter married Tim Harrison, another great endocrine surgeon, and it shows you that one of the other ways to success may be to marry the daughter or the son of a famous endocrine surgeon. He died actually in April of 1994, just one day after his wife of 62 years. So that also made him a very stable, long-term contributor. And I think that his contributions, which then became contributions in breast disease, and I was really privileged to get to know Dr. Cope during his later days when he became interested in breast disease. I met him, sat with him at a dinner, and corresponded with him after that for a while. I think he's the only man in my life who's ever called me a wondrous woman. And probably nobody else would have gotten away with it. But anyway, he was just great. And it shows that you can have tremendous insight as a young person and that it's never too late. You can make great contributions even when you're older. And so my friendship with him and knowledge of him was a special treat in my career. There are 3 developments that have dramatically changed the course of hyperparathyroidism, and I thought I would like to talk to you about those because I've lived through all of those. I remember them. I remember the impact that they had on me and on parathyroid surgery and my life. In 1964, the commercial availability of the multi-channel autoanalyzer dramatically changed the number of people who were found to have hypercalcemia. Prior to that, all laboratory tests were done one by one, and actually it took a long time to do them. There wasn't such a thing as a stat test. A stat test may mean you'd get it the same day or the next day, but certainly not in a short period of time, and you got one at a time, whatever you ordered. But with the multi-channel autoanalyzer, you got 12 at the same time, and calcium happened to be one of them. And hypercalcemia was then routinely detected and in fairly dramatically large numbers. And nobody really necessarily knew what to do about that. But it was so different. You would see, as I said, Cope reported 300 cases over 40 years, and this is just a recent publication from 2013 looking at the incidence and prevalence of primary hyperparathyroidism in different groups of people, in white, African Americans, Asians, and overall by different age groups. And these are reported per 100,000. So you can see the dramatic change that this availability of the autoanalyzer and the detection of hypercalcemia has made to our career. But what did it mean to have an increased serum calcium? Well, when it became known that so many people had an increased serum calcium, everybody said, well, it doesn't mean anything. You know, what difference does it make if you have a high calcium? And there were many other diseases that caused an increased calcium, milk alkali syndrome, the detection of vitamin D, sarcoidosis, a whole variety of things. And this is part of the text of this Ode to an Indian Rhinoceros, and pointed that out, and that your first part of your diagnosis of hyperparathyroidism had to be to rule these other diseases out. So you went through that. Then there were a couple of physical findings you looked for, band keratitis and calcium in the palpebral fissure. I looked for that for a lot of years, and I don't think I ever saw it. So that wasn't a good clue. And then you did a variety of different laboratory tests. You did the serum calcium, phosphorus, alkaline phosphatase, chloride levels. Again, sometimes they were elevated, sometimes they were low. They didn't fall into any category, and it was really not very satisfactory. The urinary excretion of calcium. We all know how easy it is to get people to collect a 24-hour urine reliably. So that was a wonderful test. Then the phosphate deprivation test, where you deprive them of phosphate and measure their phosphate excretion. And then an even more wonderful one was the 10-day cortisone administration test, where you give them hydrocortisone for 10 days to see if their calcium's dropped. And again, totally unreliable at helping you in the diagnosis of hyperparathyroidism. So you kind of had to go by your gut feeling at a certain point and decide, well, I think they probably have hyperpara, and convince this poor soul frequently who had fairly mild symptoms, fatigue, et cetera, that they should have an operation, and that was going to help them. So it was a little bit of a challenge. And then came development number 2, which was the radioimmunoassay for parathyroid hormone. As we all know, Burson and Yalow got the Nobel Prize, or actually Yalow got the Nobel Prize for developing the immunoassay of endogenous plasma insulin in man. And she used to be very proud to hold up the rejection for the JCI article that was ultimately published that described this finding. And she really would talk a lot about the process and how hard they worked to develop this assay. And relatively soon after that, she published work on a parathyroid hormone radioimmunoassay, but that only had an elevation in about 80% of the people who had hyperparathyroidism. And it wasn't really until Arnaud developed this further that we had a test that could detect about 95% of all people with hyperparathyroidism by just measuring their serum calcium and their PTH. What a wonderful thing compared to all of these tests that you had to put these people through and the amount of time that you took to do that. And it was in 1977 that actually Roz Yalow won the Nobel Prize in medicine. Sal Burson had died, so it went to her, as the Nobel Committee insists that you be living when you receive this award. I'm not sure what you do with $1 million when you're dead, but so it makes sense. And Roz Yalow was interesting, and I actually knew Roz Yalow fairly well. And she was born in 1921, and she wanted to go to medical school. And she was told that if you were Jewish and a girl, you couldn't go to medical school. So instead, she became a nuclear physicist. Not so bad. I was told the same thing 20 years later. I guess I wasn't as smart because I didn't listen, and so I went to medical school. And when I went to medical school, the irony is that I got one of my applications returned to me because I was not Jewish, and I was a girl. And in those days, there was a quota system, which was 5%, which meant that maximum number of women in a class was 5%, not the minimum. She was a stubborn and determined child, nothing that you could ever say about me. And in 1945, she actually received her PhD in nuclear physics. She was a mother of 2, and she kept a kosher kitchen. And she felt that that was something that should be expected. It wasn't more of a task for a woman to do this than for any man. I got to know her in the Endocrine Society. In the 1970s, if you were interested in endocrine surgery or endocrinology at all, there was no Association of Endocrine Surgery, and so you went to the Endocrine Society meetings, and I got to know a lot of endocrinologists there, including Dr. Yalow. And it was also at the time that there were enough women in medicine that women were sort of tired of being also there and never being invited to be leaders in any organization, participating in it any more than being in attendance. And so the Women's Caucus was formed in the Endocrine Society, and she wouldn't join. She told us she really didn't think that it was appropriate to have a women's organization, that if women just sucked it up and worked hard, they'd get whatever they deserved. And there had never been a woman officer or a member of the council even though there were many noted women endocrinologists at those days. And so then, 1977, she won the Nobel Prize. And even then, she wasn't elected president of the Endocrine Society or on the council or anything else. And she really didn't want to make an issue of this. She really was kind of a little bit upset with the women in the Women's Caucus. And then she did ultimately become elected the first woman president of the Endocrine Society in 1979. She really didn't change her way of thinking for a while, but slowly but steadily it did dawn on her that most of her male colleagues did not get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, go to the lab, come home, feed their children, go back to the lab, work all day, come home, feed their children and their husband, stay up, put them to bed, then go back to the lab to finish their work. That she did realize that might be a little bit different for her than it was for most of her male colleagues, and maybe she did have to work harder. And she finally, amazingly, said that the failure of women to have reached positions of leadership has been due in large part to social and professional discrimination. But she waffled a little bit because she said, you really can't expect those guys to give us some important jobs if we don't really act like we deserve it. So she did have mixed feelings about this, but certainly did ultimately become a feminist. And I think that's true for a lot of people. Another noted woman surgeon, Olga Jonassen, was the same way. She really just, when we started the Association of Women Surgeons, she didn't want to have anything to do with it and told me how useless the whole thing was. She ultimately changed her mind and became an avid supporter. The parathyroid hormone radioimmunoassay, it doesn't take anyone much thought to realize that it dramatically changed our understanding of parathyroid disease. It made the diagnosis extremely easy. It led to a much better understanding of the pathophysiology of the disease, of why you got the bone disease, what happened in your bones, what happened to your kidneys, and it allowed for things that we use all the time now, the intraoperative parathyroid hormone assays, the rapid assays, the discovery of normocalcemic hyperparathyroidism, and just so many, many things that it was really a sentinel event in the history of parathyroid disease. And I got to tell you, it wasn't easy. For the first 9 years of my career, I ran a basic science lab, and I tried to do PTH radioimmunoassays, and they were not easy at all. And you didn't have reference material, it stuck to glass, there were just a million problems. And if there's anything that will put horror in my mind, it's the thought of micropipetting again. I just, ugh. So it was tough. And then all of a sudden you could just buy the kit and you could do it and it wasn't that big a deal. So it made a dramatic difference. The third development was something that you might not have thought about, and it was, as far as I'm concerned, the National Institute of Health Consensus Development Conference of 1990, which was entitled The Diagnosis and Management of Asymptomatic Primary Hyperparathyroidism. And so I thought, oh, this is great. I'll go to this conference and I'll learn a lot more about it and see what's going on. And I went, and the panel posed 6 questions. One was, what was the most accurate, cost-effective diagnostic method? I thought that was pretty clear already, but they debated it. Then the real agenda of the meeting was the next 2 questions. Are there asymptomatic patients that can be followed, and should they be? And how should they be monitored and managed? What are the indications for surgery in the asymptomatic patient? And then other things such as the role of localization in parathyroid surgery and what research needs to be done to clarify these things. Well, I have to tell you that I listened to those first papers and I became physically ill. It was pretty clear to me that the agenda was, we got to get rid of all of these unnecessary operations. And we were outnumbered. The surgical representation on the panel, who was to look at all of this material and make recommendations, were 2 surgeons, Murray Brennan and Clyde Barker. Thank goodness at least they had really good familiarity with parathyroid surgeons, but there were 12 non-surgeons. And the speakers, the only 2 surgeons who were speakers were Orlo Clark and Sam Wells. And they presented at the end. And if you notice this rhino on the left-hand side, I guess it is, the big tall guy, he doesn't have ears. And I think that was my representation of the internists in that group, that they must have never listened to their patients, because if they ever had, they would have not considered all of these people asymptomatic, because the people did have fatigue, they had constipation, they had forgetfulness, they had the million things that we all know trouble these people terribly and that are improved by surgery. So that was very, very traumatic. But, you know, as all of you would expect, Dr. Clark and Dr. Wells gave magnificent presentations. They made it very clear that patients benefited from parathyroid surgery and that they benefited many, many ways, including all of these lesser ways. And that there were indications, and that if you sent patients to surgeons who understood parathyroid surgery, they would do well. They would not have all of these problems. It would be a fairly straightforward operation that went well. And certainly these surgeons who were already pretty high on my hit parade have been, you know, my real heroes ever since that time, because they saved parathyroid surgery for us, I believe, at that time. So at the end of the meeting, they did come out with what they had initially thought should be the indications for parathyroid surgery, which were increased serum calcium, a life-threatening episode of hypercalcemia. You can read these pretty straightforward things that we all know are indications for parathyroid surgery. But actually what Dr. Clark and Dr. Wells helped them add to this was that it should also be indicated if the patient wants it, if with their understanding of their disease they wanted to have it, if it was unlikely that they could be consistently followed up, if they had other illnesses that would make it difficult to manage them and observe them, and if they were young. In the entire presentation, other than by the surgeons, there was really little mention of these symptoms of complaint, of fatigue, of forgetfulness, of constipation, of aching bones, and all of that. So it was tremendous, and it was so important that we had great surgical representation there so that it wasn't inappropriate for them to have parathyroid surgery for what they considered asymptomatic disease, but which most patients don't consider asymptomatic. I think all of them should ache, be constipated, forgetful, or maybe they are forgetful, and they would want to do it. And they recommended that for the people who were followed up, they have this huge litany of tests. They get their blood pressure checked every year, their calcium, their serum creatinine clearance, radiograms to see if they had calcifications, 24-hour urines, and it was really a problem to get people to do this once, no less the thought of doing it every year. And as you add up the costs for these tests, it became sort of problematic. So that didn't happen. They also did recommend that imaging of the parathyroid glands was not necessary prior to neck exploration. And quite honestly, in those days, it was probably fairly true because many of the better localization studies had not been done. I don't know how many of you remember the compression test, where you'd actually squeeze one side of the neck and measure the PTH to see if it was elevated, then you'd squeeze the other side. That was really fun. And it didn't do a whole lot of good. So it wasn't necessarily a very good test. And that there was no evidence that imaging made a difference in the length of time of the operation, the complications of the operation, or the failure of the operation. There were actually further conferences in 2002 and 2008, but if you look at the website for the National Endocrine and Metabolic Disease Information Service today, just read these things. It makes your heart feel good. When symptoms appear, they are often mild and nonspecific. The diagnosis of primary hyperparathyroidism, when a person has the high calcium and PTH, you've made the diagnosis, that primary hyperparathyroidism is treated by surgery. Surgeons often use imaging tests before surgery to locate the overactive glands to be removed, and that almost all people with primary hyperparathyroidism who have symptoms can benefit from surgery. So in that basically 20 years, there has been a dramatic turnaround to what we all knew was true in 1990, that people benefit from parathyroid surgery and that it is important. And actually, can can you see what would have happened if we hadn't had our surgical representation there? I would think that it would have been recommended that asymptomatic hyperparathyroidism were not treated surgically, and that then Medicare wouldn't have paid for it. If Medicare didn't pay for it, do you think it would have been done very often? Not as much as it was. And certainly the primary care physicians and endocrinologists who were the source of entry of these patients into the system would have not recommended that surgery be done. So our surgical representation and these courageous surgeons who stood up in front of those people and sort of told them how it was made an enormous difference to our to what has happened throughout those years. So it's interesting. It's very important that you're always there, that you do participate in a variety of things that you may sometimes wonder why you do it. Why are you at that meeting? Why are you at that board? Why are you at that conference? But unless there's appropriate representation, you frequently don't have things turn out the way that you would wish them to. So it's important, and this organization has done that in a million ways. I think it has made this specialty a real specialty for all of us. When I started my career, there weren't endocrine surgeons. The good part about that is when you decided you wanted to be one, you could just call yourself one. You didn't have to do a fellowship or anything else, and you were an endocrine surgeon, and you could continue to do that. But it was something that has developed over the years, and you just have to attend a meeting like this to see where it has gone from those original dark days. So thank you for allowing me to give this presentation, to talk to you about something that I love. And if you want, you can also start to collect rhinoceri. They're really wonderful. This was a wooden one from Kenya. This is from the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. I go visit it every time I go to San Francisco. And this is jewelry that was made in Tibet. Now, it's interesting, they don't have rhinoceri in Tibet, so you wonder why they would make that jewelry, but they are very infatuated with rhinoceros horn for its aphrodisiac properties, and so the rhinoceros is extremely important to them, and not because of its relationship to parathyroid disease. So thank you very much for your patience and your participation.